Welcome people who are giving up a portion of your Shabbos shluff to come and learn. I promise it will not take all afternoon. The Shabbos nap is holy and very important as a mitzvah, so I want mine as well. But for everybody who is sticking around to do some more learning, I am grateful. It has been wonderful so far to be with this community for Shabbat. I have been so appreciative of the way that almost everybody here who I've had a chance to speak with, you have been so welcoming to me, and I'm glad for my friend Andy Green that this is the congregation you get to visit every Shabbat. This is clearly a special group of people. So thank you to everybody for making me feel so at home here, and looking forward to this learning and the chance to see each other tonight, and then I think one more thing on Sunday. This is a session that I have been working on and playing with now over the course of the last 10 years. It's a poem that I truly love. I'm a huge fan of poetry in general. It's actually one of the things that brought my wife and I together. On an early date, we discovered that we had a shared love of poetry and spent many, many hours reading poems together. And that's been a real bedrock in our relationship. And I particularly love modern Israeli poetry. I love modern Israeli poetry because the use of an ancient biblical language to express new ideas gives the opportunity in a poem to weave together themes that are both modern and also timeless. And the echoes that emerge out of the best modern Israeli poetry, in which the words call us back to ideas that connect through the Jewish canon over time, make reading a poet like Amichai a true joy. For those of you who are less familiar with Yehuda Amichai, he lived 1924 to 2000. On his grave marker, like the grave marker of his whole generation in Israel, there are not two dates but three. There is the date of his birth, the date of his death, and the date of his aliyah. So, born 1924 in Würzburg, Germany, came to Petach Tikva in 1934 with his family ahead of the war, lived the rest of his life in Israel, fought in the Jewish Brigade in World War II, in the War of Independence, in the Sinai Campaign, in the Six-Day War and Yom Kippur War, twice married, 3 children, 11 volumes of poetry, an extraordinary life, and truly one of Israel's greatest poets since King David. All of his poems are worth study, but this poem is a poem that I have fallen really deeply in love with, and I want to share it together and then go through it slowly and think about the way in which it echoes Torah all the way through. So I am on page 2, the slide that is listed as number 3. I'm going to read to you the whole poem in Hebrew and in English just so we can hear the music of it, and then we'll go back through and read it closely and carefully. Ro'eh Aravi mechapes kedi b'Or Tzion. Ro'eh Aravi mechapes kedi b'Or Tzion. U'b'Har Memul ni mechapes et b'ni hakatan. Ro'eh Aravi b'Av Yehudi b'Kishlonam hazmani. Kolot shaninu nifgashim me'al leberkat sultan be'emek ba'emsa. Shnei rotzim shelo yikansu, haben v'hagdi letoch tachlich, hamechana hanora'ah shel chad gadya. Achar kach matzanu otam ben asichim, v'kolotenu chazru aleinu, u'bachu v'tzachaku bifnim. Achubasim achar gdi v'achar ben hayu tamid, hatchalat dat chadasha b'harim ha'eleh. An Arab shepherd is searching for his goat on Mount Zion. And on the opposite hill, I am searching for my little boy. An Arab shepherd and a Jewish father, both in their temporary failure. Our two voices meet above the Sultan's pool in the valley between us. Neither of us wants the boy or the goat to get caught in the wheels of the Chad Gadya machine. Afterwards, we found them among the bushes, and our voices came back inside us, laughing and crying. Searching for a goat or a child has always been the start of a new religion in these mountains. It's a Beautiful poem. We're going to read through carefully, and we're going to listen for echoes. Echoes of the biblical tradition that started out the canon of Hebrew literature, echoes from the Jewish past, ancient and more recent, that all come together to form this remarkably deep piece of literature. We're going to start with the first line, the first character, Roe Aravi, an Arab shepherd looking for a lost goat. I want to ask us to think together about shepherds. When you see a shepherd in a biblical poem, or not in a Hebrew poem rather, what are some of the shepherds that might pop to mind? Who might this be echoing? David. David's a good example. David, who as a young shepherd boy got good with a slingshot and used it to take down a big guy named Goliath and gain fame that ultimately led him to become king and the greatest poet of Israel's history, the author of the 150 Psalms, at least the traditional author of the Psalms. So it maybe calls to mind a little bit of David. Who else might come to mind when we're thinking about shepherds? Moses, the faithful shepherd, the Raya Mahemna, the faithful shepherd of the Jewish people. The story of why Moses gets picked to lead the people out of slavery comes to us from the Midrash, that tells the story that Moses was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Yitro, and noticed that one of his little sheep was missing. He went after him to find that sheep and found it drinking water at an oasis, and Moses said, "I had no idea you were so tired and thirsty," and picks up that sheep and carries that sheep back to the flock. And God looks down and says, if this is how he shepherds the flock of his father-in-law, this is the shepherd I want for my flock. That's a story told in Exodus Rabbah, in a rabbinic collection of midrashim about Moses. So Moses is a shepherd. David is a shepherd. Abraham is a shepherd. From the very beginning, our patriarchs are shepherds, going out after the herds, following them on a journey that ultimately leads to the foundation of our people. Any other shepherds? Jacob was most definitely shepherding sheep. Yeah? Yes, yeah, and some complicated which goats went where. Anybody else come to mind? Yeah, Rabbi?
So some of you know my son Dak, his middle name in Hebrew is Ro'id, coming from Psalm 23, Adonai Ro'i lo asar, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want.
What a good rabbi answer. God is a shepherd. God is a shepherd. On the high holidays, we say that we each pass before God like a shepherd looking over each one of his sheep, and God recognizes us and knows us by name even amidst this flock. I actually had the remarkable opportunity about 15 years ago to take a group of Jewish teenagers on a service learning program to Navajo. I think we were right in the Four Corners region. I don't know if we were in Arizona or New Mexico. But we camped out on the land of a native family and did Habitat for Humanity kind of work on the reservation for a number of weeks. And we actually stayed on the land of a shepherd and got to talk to the shepherd. And one of the things that I'll never forget that he told me is he said, you look at this whole flock of sheep and they all look the same to you. The mark of a shepherd is that he knows his sheep well enough that he can recognize each and every one. That what other people see as one undifferentiated mass, I have the capacity to see individually. And I think about that every year when we get to that line in High Holidays, about God seeing each one of us passing forward like sheep. That's not a statement that we are all the same to God. That's actually a statement that God is a true good shepherd who can look at something that to all of us would seem like just a mass of humanity and know each and every one of God's children by name. So when we start with a shepherd, we all of a sudden are transported to our whole biblical tradition, to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. We are transported to Moses. We are transported to David. We are transported to God, and by the way, there's no reason why this needs to be exclusively within the Jewish tradition. Of course, Jesus is described as a good shepherd in Christianity. And of course, Muhammad was involved in the trading and caravanning of animals. There is a whole lot of tradition of shepherding being associated with religious and spiritual leadership. So I want us to just have that kind of floating around in our head, that when we are talking about Ro'eh or Avi, this one Arab shepherd, in some way we are talking about this one shepherd looking for his lost kid, and in another way, it is echoing to every shepherd of our past who looked out over their flock and had to keep track of each and every kid. I'll tell you one other thing that I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's true, but I want it to be true, and so I tell people, you know the tradition of placing a stone on a grave when you go to visit rather than placing flowers? Nobody's quite sure where that tradition came from, but one of the theories is that shepherds would carry with them a little pouch. And in that pouch, they would place a number of pebbles corresponding to the number of sheep in their flock. And when at the end of the day they were bringing their flocks back down from the hills, they would count their sheep against the pebbles in the little baggie, and that was their accounting system to make sure every sheep came home. Except, of course, if a sheep didn't come home. If a sheep got lost, if a sheep got carried away, if something happened, they would be left with a pebble. And they'd place it back down on the earth. And so one way of understanding what we do when we go to a grave and place a stone there is to say, one from the flock is missing. One didn't come home. And we see you, and we remember you. And that's my kavanah when I place a stone on a grave. And again, I don't know if it's historically true, but it's a story that I find gives me the chills every time that I place a stone. And so that's become part of my kavanah. So we start with the Ro'eh Aravi, this Arab shepherd who is an echo of all of the shepherds in this piece of land going way, way back. And on the opposite hill, says the next line, I am looking for my little boy. If we were to come up with a theme that defined the book of Genesis, the theme could be looking for and losing sons. Right? It's the theme over and over and over again with each generation of the patriarchs and matriarchs. They hope for a child. Here in the patriarchal stories, they're hoping for a son. My apologies. It was written a very long time ago. I have a daughter. I know that they are missing out. But they are looking for a son. They're looking for an heir. Abraham and Sarah, a childless couple who's promised that they are going to create a family that will outnumber the stars, and yet, no sons. And so, what do Abraham and Sarah do? Well, Sarah hatches a plan. She says, if I can't produce a son for you, have a son through my handmaiden Hagar. And that son is Ishmael. In our memory, our people's memory, Ishmael becomes the progenitor of Arab peoples, of Islam. And then Sarah and Abraham have the child they were always intended to have. Isaac becomes the progenitor for us. And the story repeats, Isaac and Rebekah trying to conceive, and ultimately Rebekah, after a terribly difficult pregnancy, gives birth to two sons, Esau and Jacob. Here, a surplus of sons, twins. But Esau goes off in his own direction and does not continue the family story. And Jacob, after some mischief together with his mother and tricking their elderly blind father out of a blessing, winds up lost to his father. In the same way that Isaac wound up lost to his father. After the Akedah, after the binding of Isaac's story, of course, Abraham and Isaac, father and son, never speak again. So Abraham and Sarah hope for children, and they wind up with two sons, one who goes off, sent off into the desert, who will be the father of a different people, another estranged from the family through an act of spiritually condoned near violence. The next generation searches for sons, and again has those sons slip through their fingers. Jacob has a superabundance of sons. Jacob has no problem with sons, 12 sons. But Jacob has one particular son that he loves most of all, and that's Joseph. And what's the story of what happens to Joseph? Because of his unwise love, because of not knowing that he needs to treat each and every one of his children as beloved, he winds up losing the one who he actually held most close to his heart. As the brothers sell Joseph off into slavery and tell their father that he was torn apart by a beast, that he went out with the flocks and never came back. Over and over and over again in our history, we have these fathers who can't seem to hold on to the sons once they get them. And so, just from the first couplet of this poem, we are carrying on our backs the whole biblical tradition. We are carrying on our backs shepherds like Abraham and Moses and David and God, charged with watching over flocks. And we are carrying on our backs fathers searching for sons and seeing them slipping through their fingers, the thing that they are most sworn to protect, that they can't seem to hold on to, generation after generation after generation. An Arab shepherd and a Jewish father, both in their temporary failure. I love the Hebrew here. The Hebrew, kishlonam zmani, means a failure in time. You know that phrase, right? It was just the wrong time. It was just the wrong time. It's not that anybody did anything wrong. It's just that the time didn't work out. Here, these two men searching after the thing they're supposed to protect, and they're finding themselves in a very dangerous moment in time, in a temporary failure, in a failure in time. Our voices meet above the Sultan's pool in the valley between us. So Amichai is a poet of Jerusalem. He lived most of his life in Jerusalem, wrote many, many of his poems about the city of Jerusalem. One of my favorite is a poem in which he says, "How sad to be the mayor of Jerusalem. All you can do is build and build and build. And at night, the wild stones in the hills come down to howl at the domesticated stones like wild dogs howling at kept puppies. That all you can do is pile these stones on top of stones on top of stones in an ancient city, but the idea that you can ever own Jerusalem, that you can ever plan Jerusalem, that you can ever contain Jerusalem, means that mayor of Jerusalem is no job for a nice Jewish boy." He has another lovely line in a poem. He says, "I no longer want Yerushalayim Shel Mala, the heavenly Jerusalem. But I don't want the Yerushalayim Shel Mata either, the earthly Jerusalem. Can't we have Yerushalayim Shel Emsa, the Jerusalem in the middle? We can't live in heaven. And the earthly Jerusalem, it's too hard. I want something in between." Anyway, Amichai is a poet of Jerusalem, and to read his poetry is to walk the streets of Jerusalem, and he's inviting us to see precisely where these two men are standing. They're standing on opposite hills, with a valley in between them, with the Sultan's pool. Now, I provided a map down below. It's a satellite map. It's not super easy to read. But if you've traveled in Israel, if you've spent time in Jerusalem, I think you're going to be able to picture what I'm talking about. The Arab shepherd is standing on Mount Zion. Mount Zion is the hill right outside of the Old City. It's not actually within the Old City walls. It's the hill on top of which sits the beautiful Church of the Dormition, where Mary is said to have fallen into eternal sleep. It's the hill on which King David is said to be buried, and the floor above King David is said to be the room of the Last Supper, and the floor above that is a mosque. It's a very ecumenical building. Mount Zion is the place that we say Torah emerges from. Ki mitzion, Tetzei Torah. That Zion, that's this hill where the Arab shepherd is standing. And on the opposite hill stands the Jewish father. The opposite hill, if you can picture it, is the neighborhood of the Yamin Moshe, where the windmill is. That hill comprises the two earliest neighborhoods of what's called now the new city of Jerusalem, the new Jewish settlement that began around the beginning of the 20th century and established what is now the metropolis of Jewish Jerusalem, West Jerusalem. All of Jerusalem is Jewish, but newly built Jewish Jerusalem. The valley in between the old city and the new, between Mount Zion and Yamin Moshe, is called the Hinnom Valley. The Hinnom Valley has within it something called the Sultan's Pool. It was a Turkish ruin there. Today there's an amphitheater there, and you can go and see concerts sitting out at the Sultan's Pool in the Hinnom Valley. There's also always kids kicking soccer balls in this green, lush, beautiful valley. But the Hinnom Valley actually has a serious echo in Jewish thought. The Hinnom Valley was not always a place that you went for concerts and to play soccer. The Hinnom Valley means something very different. If you flip the page and look at slide 9. Ahaz was 20 years old at the start of his reign and ruled in Jerusalem for 16 years. However, he did not do what was right in the sight of God. While he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, he made molten images for Baalim. He made idols. He burned incense in the valley of Hinnom and burnt his children there in fire, following the abominations of the Canaanites, whom God had cast out. Look then at Jeremiah. They have set up their abominations in the house which I called by my name, and they have defiled it. They have built shrines in the valley of Hinnom to burn their sons and daughters in fire, something I never commanded, which never came to my mind. Surely there is coming a day when men will no longer speak of the valley of Hinnom, but the valley of death. And I will silence in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem, kol sason v'kol simcha, kol chatan v'kol kala. I will silence in Jerusalem the sounds of mirth and gladness, the voice of bridegroom and bride. If you hear in this the seventh of the Sheva Brachot, this is where it comes from. Kind of a strange context, right? The Hinnom Valley was remembered to be the place where Canaanites, the Jebusite tribe who had Jerusalem before King David came, would bring their sons and daughters as human sacrifice. That the Hinnom Valley was the place where people would sacrifice their children, and in the worst moments, our Bible tells us, of Jewish history, we Jews repeated that ancient sin. And for that specific sin, for the specific sin of the sacrifice of children, God says, for that reason, you will no longer think of Hinnom as the valley of Hinnom, but rather as the valley of death, and this will be your undoing. In Hebrew, the word for valley is ge, Hinnom, Gehinnom, Gehennom. You might know that word. What does the word Gehennom mean? Hell. Gehinnom is literally the valley of hell. Why is Gehinnom the valley of hell? Because the worst thing that a Jew could imagine is a place where people go to sacrifice their children. The worst thing a human being could imagine is a place that people go to sacrifice and burn their children. When people are going to a concert at the Sultan's Pool, when kids are playing soccer in the Hinnom Valley, they are literally standing in hell. So where is the Arab shepherd and the Jewish father? On the two hills that are on either side of the valley of hell. They are standing at the precipice of Gehinnom, of the place where children went and did not come back. By the way, the Hinnom Valley, from 1949 to 1967, was the no man's land between Israel and Jordan, full of barbed wire with snipers sitting on Mount Zion and snipers sitting in Yamin Moshe, and anybody who walked into the valley of death met their end. So this is an ancient echo to the times of Jeremiah, to the times of the Jebusites, and this is, for Amichai, a modern echo when the valley of hell was for 20 years of his lifetime. That again. Gives a different resonance, I suppose, to the stakes here. The lost kid, the lost child, And what's in between these two men? None other than the valley of death and the place of the sacrifice of the thing which we are supposed to keep safe. Shnenu rotzim shelo yikansu haben v'hagdi letoch tachlich hamechana hanora'ah shel chad gadya. I kept this in the Hebrew because I wanted you to hear the music. Neither of us want the son or the kid to enter into mechana nora'ah shel chad gadya, the great and terrible chad gadya machine. We're about to sing chad gadya. Friday night, it concludes many of our seders. Do you do it with sound effects? We do it with sound effects, right? Then comes just to remind you, right? There's a little kid that my father bought for 2 zuzim, and what happens to the kid? Gets bit by a meow. And then the cat gets bit by a woof. And then what happens to the dog? He gets beat with a stick. And then what happens to the stick? He gets burned in a fire, and what happens to the fire? Clenched by the water, and what happens to the water? Whoop, whoop, gets drunk up by an ox, and then what happens to the poor ox? Slaughtered by the shochet, and the shochet gets slaughtered by the malach hamavet, the angel of death. My Zaidi, who is 93 years old, does a very specific malach hamavet laugh every year, which I have recorded so I can have it forever. I will not attempt it for you, but it is the creepiest thing you've ever heard in your life. The angel of death comes and takes the shochet, and what ultimately happens at the end? God has to enter in and kill the angel of death. L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, get out of my house. We've got Seder tomorrow. We have to clean up. It's a weird song. It's a super weird song. It's a song that doesn't, it seems like a children's song, like a little old lady who swallowed a fly, but involves God slaughtering one of God's angels. I mean, the theological stuff going on in Chad Gadya is wild, wild. Ultimately, Chad Gadya is a messianic song. It's about a vision of a world in which God conquers the final enemy, which is death. That at the conclusion of the Seder, at the conclusion of our celebration of liberation, we are imagining a time when God ultimately liberates all of us from the tyranny of the Malach HaMavet, the tyranny of death. Because the end of the Seder is all Messiah, culminating, of course, with next year in Jerusalem. Here, in this poem, the stakes couldn't be higher. The kid and the child are poised at the edge of the valley of death. And the Mechana Hanora'ah Shel Chad Gadya, the great and terrible Chad Gadya machine, God has not yet slaughtered the angel of death. The machine is still chug, 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 chug. What do you think of when you think of it being described as a machine? Why does he use that word? Anybody have a thought? Why is it Mechana? We have been doing this for so long. We have been doing it, and we never learn. The Canaanites sacrificed their children here, and we came along with a whole revelation that said, this is not what we do. Abraham got this whole message during the Akedah, this is not what we do. And yet, in the worst times in our history, that's what we did. And you know what? It's not just then. Fathers have been sacrificing their sons for a real long time, haven't they? People have been sending off their sons to fight and to die in conflicts that are not of those sons' making. And they feel like machines. Machines that go and go without thought, that go and go without empathy, and that demand to be fed. Yeah. A killing machine. A killing machine in which these things which we were pledged to protect. I am pledged to protect my little sheep. I'm pledged to protect my little son. They might get caught. They might get caught and I might never see them again. And I'm terrified. And a machine suggests a cycle. right? A treadmill that just keeps going. And we know the way in which violence is cyclical. This is not a political session. It's not a political session. It's not a question of who's to blame or what's to be done to solve it or who's supposed to do what. But we do know this dance, right? We know the cycle that says, our sons, so their sons, so our sons, so their sons, so our sons, so their sons. With nobody having any idea how that's supposed to end. We just know that we have to do something, and so they have to do something, so we have to do something, so they have to do something. And nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants the Chad Gadya machine anymore. Amichai says, and so we're terrified. But this poem has a happy ending. Achar kach, afterwards, Matzanu otam bein hasichim, v'kolatenu chazru aleinu, u'bachu v'tzachaku bifnim. Afterwards, we found them amongst the bushes, the kid and the child playing together in the bushes in this valley of the shadow of death, and our voices returned to us. And they were crying and they were laughing. Tears of relief and of joy, the laughter of released tension when it turns out to be okay. And this line wants to take us back to the Akedah. It wants to take us back to the binding of Isaac. The binding of Isaac begins with the words, Acharei devarim ha'ele. After these things, God put Abraham to the test. This begins, Achar kach, after these things. Where did we find the kid and the child? We found them bein hasichim. Who in the binding of Isaac story is found bein hasichim amongst the bushes? The ram. The ram who gets sacrificed in place of Isaac. That ram appears over and over again, by the way, in Israeli poetry. There are a number of poems about the image of the ram who is brought as sacrifice, and using that ram to think about all of the boys and girls who have died in Israel's conflicts. Our voices come back to us, and we're crying, v'tzachaku, and we're laughing. Of course, the root of that word is the same as the root for the name, Yitzchak, Isaac. He's kind of beating us over the head. Achar kach, sichim, tzachaku, akedah, akedah, akedah. The story of the near sacrifice, the near miss. The story which we tell over and over again because we're supposed to learn how not to repeat the past. And yet, we somehow struggle to learn. This poem below is from Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen, a young man, a poet in World War I. He died in the trenches just days before the armistice. He died November 14th, 1918. The armistice, of course, was on November 11th of that same month. He came within a week of getting home. This is a poem he wrote in the trenches. So Abram rose and clave the wood and went and took the fire with him and a knife. And as they sojourned, both of them together, Isaac the firstborn spoke and said, My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron, but where the lamb for the burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son, when lo, an angel called out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. He's writing this from the trenches. A young man being sent into a war which made no sense. A war that happened because one country had a treaty with another country, had a treaty with another country, and somehow into Mechana Hanora'ah, into that machine, got fed a third of the youth of Europe at that time. He says, God was calling out from heaven to Abram to say, stop, don't do it. And Abram said, I'm going to do it anyway. And hasn't that been the story? The story is that we're told to seek peace. The story is that we're told to stop offering up our children, and somehow there is something within us that can't quite stop, that can't quite get the lesson. In this case, the story is a happy ending, but Amichai knew many, many stories that didn't have happy endings. But he wants to give us hope. He wants to give us hope, and he says in the last lines, the search after a lost goat or a son has always been the start of a new religion in these mountains. The story doesn't have to be the story that once was. The story can be new. The story can be different. We don't have to feed the Chad Gadya machine. We can find a different way. I don't know how. If I knew how, I'd win the Nobel Prize. But I know we need a new religion in these mountains. A new way of being together, a new way forward. Because the only alternative leads straight to the valley of the shadow of death. And that way can't be the way. In Jeremiah, it said, because you sacrificed your children there, this valley of Hinnom will be known as the valley of killing, of slaughter, and I will shut down kol sason v'kol simcha, kol chatan v'kol kala. And later on, Jeremiah comes back to that same prophecy and continues. And I will restore the fortunes of Judah and Israel, and I will rebuild them as of old. I will purge them of all their sins they have committed against me, and I will pardon them of all their sins. And there will be heard again in this place which you say is ruined without man or beast, Gedi uben, without kid or child, in the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem, kol sason v'kol simcha, kol chatan v'kol kala, the voice of mirth and gladness, the voice of bridegroom and bride. The sad part isn't the end of the story. The end of the story is restoration. But who's it up to? Who's it up to create a different future? It's up to us. We have a choice. This poem says we have a choice to continue to feed the machine, to continue to need to, week after week, month after month, get up and say, these three beautiful young men who were lost for no reason at all. You know, every time I plan to teach this, and I plan ahead of time, I show up there and I say, you know, this week especially, we need to read this. Because every damn time, there's something. Aren't we tired of that? And so, we have a choice, says this poem, says Amichai, veteran of 5 wars, a realist, a person who understands, not a hippie, a person who has been at the front lines of conflict. We have a choice. And he says we want to make a different one. I want to close with a modern poet who I think has the potential to be a future Amichai. It's a guy named Andrew Lustig, a young Jewish guy writing beautiful poetry. He's a good friend. He wrote a poem called One Day, and this is the end of it. He says, one day we will realize that wars are painted in black and white, no matter how we color them, and that peace, no matter how dark its prospects seem, demands knowing the color of our enemies' eyes. One day I will shake the hand of the man whose father tried to kill mine, and my father his, and we will not embrace. We will want to hit each other. But out of respect for our children who have found a ball and have made up a new game where they throw the ball to each other and try to catch it, we will grit our teeth and pinch our lips and grip as tightly as we can and nod. One day we will dream again. One day it will not be a dream. Nothing about the world in which we're living right now is easy. And anybody who says they have an easy answer is selling something and not selling something good. What is the solution in Ukraine? What is the solution in Israel? What is the solution in so many places facing such horrors? I wish I knew. But I do know that the world as it is not the world as it ought to be. And I do know that the only way to get across the wilderness is by joining together with other people who feel the same. And so we come back to poetry, the poetry of the Siddur, the poetry of Amichai, the poetry of Torah. A wonderful teacher, head of a Lithuanian yeshiva, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv, wrote in his introduction to his commentary on the Torah, Ha'emek HaDavar, Kol HaTorah Kula Shira. The whole Torah is a song. The whole Torah is a poem. We come back to the Torah of our Siddur. We come back to the Torah of our poets. We come back to the Torah of our Torah and its poetry in order to restore our faith that a different kind of future is possible, in order to plug back in to the part of us that hopes and dreams about something different and maybe invites us to figure out if we can put one foot in front of the other for a different kind of world, because our children and our grandchildren deserve that. Shabbat Shalom.